Welcome, welcome. This is going to be exciting. This is a free class tonight, I believe, right? Good. So some of you may be new to this whole process. I'm Ben, by the way. I'm one of the co-founders here at LSAT Demon, and we're going to do a class. If you have questions, you can ask Abigail or Christine in the chat. They can help you with just about anything. Also, the Demon community is extraordinarily astute, and they are quick to jump in and provide sometimes better advice than I have. So yeah, use that chat to your advantage. Let me do one thing here really quick. I don't know, Christine, Abigail, do you have anything to add to that short welcome? I'll take that as a no.
Sorry, my microphone wasn't unmuting. No, I think that's all. I just posted in the chat too that if anyone is more comfortable DMing me or Christine, you can do that as well. I'll post questions in the chat or click the little reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand if you want to ask your question to Ben.
Awesome. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'm just going to jump right in here. I hope that's okay with you all. Tonight, we are going to talk about LSAT's two most common flaws. The title in the syllabus is Flaw, Confusing, Sufficient, and Necessary. That is probably the LSAT's #1 flaw in logical reasoning. But it's hard to talk about this subject without talking about the second most common flaw, which is confusing correlation with causation, right? In part because sometimes when people are reading an argument that involves the sufficient and necessary flaw, they often get mixed up and they get the question wrong because they think that they're dealing with a correlation causation issue. And when they're looking at a correlation causation issue, sometimes they think that they're looking at a confusing sufficient for necessary issue. So if all that sounds super confusing, that's okay. Those are not terms that we use super commonly in everyday speech. So let me try to explain them as best I can. When the LSAT, let's see here. Let me just start with an example. So if I said to you, if you drink the poison, then you're going to get sick. Okay. If you drink the poison, then you're going to get sick. That is called a conditional statement. It's an if-then statement, but it's called a conditional statement because there are two conditions in it, right? The first condition is if you drink the poison. The second condition is then you will get sick. The LSAT and probably other places, but I only know about the LSAT. The LSAT calls that if clause, if you drink the poison, the sufficient condition, okay? And they call the then clause, then you will get sick, the necessary condition. And the reason that they call it those two conditions that way is because that's actually what they are. If it's true that if you drink the poison, then you will get sick, drinking the poison is the sufficient condition. In other words, it is enough to guarantee that you will be sick. Okay? Now, you could argue with me. You could say, hey, look, I know people who have drunk poison and they never got sick. We're not talking about that. We're assuming that when we're given sentences like this on the LSAT, that they are in fact true if they are presented as evidence, right? So if the LSAT says, if you drink poison, then you will get sick, you just have to nod your head and say, okay, got it. You know, we see this in the games all the time. They have if-then statements that are completely ludicrous. If Jones goes fourth, then Sarah has to go fifth. Why the hell does that have to be true? I have no idea, but it doesn't matter. The point is that when you see an if-then statement in logical reasoning and it's presented as evidence, you just have to assume that it's true. The if clause is the sufficient condition because it guarantees that the then clause will happen, right? The then clause, in this case, getting sick, is called the necessary condition because it's what has to happen. It's necessary. If you run into me on the street for some odd reason, and you ask me some odd question like, have you ever been sick? And I said to you, no. And let's assume that's true. I've never, ever been sick in my life. Okay. Well, could I have drunk this supposed poison? Okay. I see some of you shaking your head, which means I guess you're still paying attention, which is awesome. No, there's no way you could have drunk that poison because it was the sufficient condition. Drinking it guaranteed that I would get sick. So if I've never gotten sick in my life, there's no way I could have drunk that. That's the definition of something that's necessary. If getting sick is a necessary condition, then if you don't have that condition, if that hasn't happened, then it's impossible for you to have done the sufficient condition, right? It's necessary. That's why we're saying it's necessary. Okay, I'm sorry if that's seems like I'm talking in circles, but that's in part because the two clauses define each other, right? When something is sufficient for something else, when something guarantees that something else will happen, then by definition, that other thing turns out to be necessary for the first thing. Okay, if that's all confusing, just remember this. The if clause is the sufficient condition, and the then clause is the necessary condition because it's what has to happen. Okay, so if I drink the poison, then we know that I'm going to get sick. That's necessary. I think we're all comfortable with that, right? What made me sick?
Drinking the poison.
Okay, that's a totally reasonable guess, given the fact that I said if you drink it, then you are guaranteed to get sick. But the reality is that we don't actually have any clue what's causing me to get sick. All we know is that if you drink that poison, hey, you're going to end up sick. Now, given our understanding of poison and our understanding of sickness, it's very normal to assume that the poison is causing the sickness. But let me give you another example that uses the exact same kind of logic. It has an if-then statement, and then I'm going to ask you what the cause is. So let's assume that you read on the LSAT that if I go outside, if Ben goes outside, it will be sunny. It will be sunny. Now, again, that's a ludicrous statement in the world, right? It's like, oh, I'm limited to going outside only when it's sunny. But if we read that on the LSAT and we say, okay, this is true. If Ben goes outside, then it's sunny. Going outside is the sufficient condition. It guarantees that it will be sunny. So if I go outside, you know it has to be sunny. So if it's nighttime, if it's not sunny, then you know I haven't gone outside, right? Because as soon as I go outside, it's going to be sunny. Are you guys okay with that? Okay, so what causes it to be sunny? Are we suggesting by the fact that if I go outside, it's going to be sunny, that my going outside causes the sun to come up? No, most likely, I'm scared of the dark or something like that, right? So if I go outside, it absolutely has to be sunny because I cannot step outside if it's not. Something's, going on in my head that's a little off. But in any case, the point is that an if-then statement, even though it sounds like it's creating a causal relationship, it's not. Okay? It's just telling you if this thing happens, then we know this other thing is going to happen, but we don't know the how or the why. We can certainly speculate, but they're two different things. Are you guys okay with this? I know this runs counter to our intuitive understanding of the world. In fact, if you said, if you drink poison, then you will get sick, and you started going around saying, well, gee, I wonder why you get sick. Most people would think you're not really putting 2 and 2 together. You're just, so there is value in making assumptions about the world, but the LSAT is asking us to be very, very strict and say, if you don't know, then don't say you know, right? Okay, so in any case, my point is that these are two different things. Now let's stay focused on if-then statements for a half second. If I say, if I drink the poison, then I'm going to get sick. Can I conclude that if someone is sick, that they drank the poison? Nope. I hope we all like instantly recognize, no, you cannot do that. If you do, and I know that's a simple example, but I just want you to get your mind wrapped around the verbiage here. If you do that, then what you've done is you've treated what is in fact a necessary condition. What was the necessary condition? It was getting sick, right? And you've treated that as if it were a sufficient condition. You said, aha, this person is sick, therefore I can conclude from that that they must have drunk the poison. No, that is the LSAT's #1 flaw. You were told if you drink the poison, you're going to get sick, and you mistakenly conclude, oh, well, if they're sick, then they must have drunk the poison. That's confusing sufficient for necessary, because you're treating a necessary condition as if it were a sufficient condition. Are you guys all cool with that? Okay, let me give you another example that's a little, tries to kind of rub against our intuitions, right? Okay, so if we, let me think about this for a second. If we don't get the software update, okay, at our company, then we're not going to finish the project on time. You guys cool with this? Okay. But I have good news for you. We're getting the update right now. Okay, what does that imply?
Nothing.
I'll finish the project on time.
Okay, so if you said nothing, you're absolutely right. If you felt like, oh wait, okay, that's good news, we're getting the update, therefore we're going to finish the project on time, you're actually making that mistake of confusing sufficient for necessary. And the reason why is, let's go back to the original claim. The original claim was if we don't get the update, then we won't finish the project on time. Just stop and think about it for a second. What is necessary? What am I saying is necessary to finish the project?
Getting the update.
So
Getting the
you need
update.
to update.
Yeah. So if I say, hey, if you don't get the update, then you're not going to finish the project. What I'm really saying is it's necessary that I get the update if I want to finish the project. If I finish the project, then I must have gotten the update, right? That's another way of thinking about it. But then I wrongly concluded, oh, I got the update, therefore I'll finish on time. You've treated what is in fact necessary, getting the update, as if it were sufficient. You're like, oh, we got the update, so we're good to go. No, there may be a whole list of other things that you also need. If we don't get the update, then we won't finish the project on time. If we don't hear back from the lead contractor, then we won't finish the project on time. Like the list of necessary things could go on forever. Okay. So whenever you see an if-then statement, or it doesn't even have to be an if-then statement, whenever you see a claim, ask yourself, is this telling me that something is necessary for something else? And then if it is, that's the necessary condition, and the other condition is the sufficient condition. Okay. And then sometimes, you know, the LSAT mistakenly concludes that the necessary condition, if it's satisfied, is good enough to complete the project. And now it's just erroneously turned that necessary condition into a sufficient condition, and we can't do that. Okay. Alrighty. Let's talk about confusing correlation for causation. So I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, but a lot of times when people see an if-then statement, they actually think that a causal claim is being made, right? They think that I'm saying that the poison caused the sickness, but really all I'm saying is, well, it guarantees that you'll get sick, but I don't know why. In any case, when it comes to correlation and causation, a correlative claim is simply a claim that states that two things happen together. Okay, so for example, this is super common, but people who smoke tend to get lung cancer. Now notice the verb in that sentence is get. I said tend to get, but we can actually ignore that. People get kind of distracted by the words tend to. Just focus on the word get. People who smoke get lung cancer. More accurately, they tend to get lung cancer. But the point is they get it. But the word get just says that these things are happening together, that if you have this characteristic, if you smoke, then you tend to get lung cancer. But I'm not making a claim about what caused that, right? So if the LSAT said people who smoke tend to get lung cancer, therefore you should avoid smoking to avoid lung cancer, or therefore smoking causes lung cancer, they've jumped from a correlation to a causal claim, a correlative claim to a causal claim, and that's a problem. It's not that things that are correlated don't necessarily have a causal relationship. They certainly do in a lot of cases. The problem is that we just don't know for sure, right? Like, I know it might sound bizarre, but it's very possible that people who smoke do so to relieve their anxiety, and their anxiety is actually what leads to lung cancer. Sounds crazy, but it's a possibility, right? It's possible that you're an anxious person. Being anxious makes you want to smoke. Being anxious also makes you more likely to get lung cancer. So people who smoke tend to get lung cancer, but it's not because the smoking is causing the lung cancer. It's because the anxiety is causing both. And those two things just happen together. They happen to be correlated, but there's no causal relationship between them. Are you guys okay with that? Anyone want to yell at me and say, no, no, no? Okay. So the point here is that when the LSAT draws a causal conclusion, you want to look back and see if the evidence was merely correlative. If it's merely telling you whether two things happen together and that's it, then we got a problem. Sometimes though, the conclusion is causal. And if I look back at the evidence, I'm like, oh, but the evidence is causal too. So there's not a flaw there, at least. There might be some other flaw, but there's not a correlation to causation flaw. Okay. Now, the best way to decide, in my mind, it's not the only way, and unfortunately, it doesn't cover all circumstances, but in general, the best way to decide whether a sentence is causal or correlative is to look at the verb. Okay, so if I said to you, smokers tend to get is the verb, that's correlative. But if I said smoking causes, that's obviously causal. But I could also say something like smoking promotes lung cancer, or smoking increases your chances of getting lung cancer. Increases is the verb there, and increases tells you that this thing is having an effect on something else, right? Or if I say decreases, if I said smoking decreases your chances of getting lung cancer, then it is in fact having an effect on my lung cancer, right? So that's a causal claim rather than merely a correlative claim. Okay, how are we feeling?
So what would be an example of like a correlation again? Like how would they phrase correlations?
Okay, so yeah, let me give you another one. People who buy 2 pairs of running shoes run faster than those who only buy 1. What do you think? Is that correlative or causal?
Sounds correlated.
Okay, it is, because all I'm saying is that people who do this are going faster, but I'm not saying that the act of doing that, of buying those 2 pairs of shoes, makes you faster, right? Like if I said buying 2 pairs of shoes makes you a faster runner. Well, makes is a causal claim, or increases your speed. Increases is a causal verb. So again, it's a causal claim. But all I said is that these people are faster, but we don't know why. So, okay. Any other questions? Oh, would the word because turn it causal? Yes. So the word because is often used to introduce evidence or premises, right, on the test. So it's not like every time you see the word because, all of a sudden you're looking at a causal claim. But in some cases, because is used in a different sense, and it's creating a causal claim. So, for example, Sarah was fired because she was perpetually late, right? What I'm saying there is that her tardiness caused her to be fired. So that's an example where the because is not being used as evidence. It's not like I'm trying to prove that she was fired. We all agree that she was fired. I'm trying to explain why she was fired. And so then it becomes a causal claim. All right. I hope all this causal, correlative, necessary, sufficient isn't like too overwhelming. Like these are not terms we use very often, but any last questions? If not, we can jump into the examples. All righty, let's do this. Okay, so go ahead and do set 1. I'll give you guys about 6 minutes. Answer the questions. Your number 1 job is to first understand what you're reading. Okay, so I know we just talked about a lot of things, and that can actually be a detriment. I mean, I want you to understand it, but at the same time, sometimes you're so fixated on those terms that you're not paying attention to what you're reading. So this is going to sound weird, but literally forget everything I just told you and focused first and foremost on reading and understanding the argument and deciding for yourself whether you think it's good or bad. Then, as you start to unpack it, you might start to see these things, but don't worry about them while you're reading the argument. Just try to understand what that author is saying and whether you think they're a nimwit or they actually have a good point. Good luck. Okay, so that was about 6 minutes. How many people are done? Okay, decent number of us. If you're not done, just join us and see what we can learn together. Okay. Questions? Hunter, do you have a question? Or you just raising your hand saying you did it? Okay, gotcha. That works. Okay, cool. I'm gonna jump in and I'm gonna read this as I would read it on the test and just tell you what I'm thinking as I go through it. Okay. I'm starting with the first question, which I think, what was that? The nutrition labels one. Okay. Test 65, section 1, question 8. It says the proportion of fat calories in the diets of people who read the nutrition labels on food products is significantly lower than it is in the diets of people who do not read nutrition labels. Okay, that's a decently wordy sentence, but the proportion of fat calories, so the percentage of fat in the diets of people who read nutrition labels is a lot lower than it is for the people who don't read nutrition labels. Now, if you heard this on CNN, it would not be uncommon for some commentator to immediately jump to the fact or jump to the conclusion that, oh, well, look, it looks like reading these labels encourages people to cut their fat intake, right? Because the people who read these labels have so much less fat in their diet. But really all that's going on here is a correlation. So this sentence is just telling me, hey, if you read those nutrition labels, then you're going to have a lot less fat in your diet, but it doesn't tell me why, right? It doesn't say that reading the labels is reducing my fat. For all I know, something else like health consciousness itself, right, is motivating me to reduce the fat in my diet and motivating me to read these labels. I have no idea. So when you see a correlative claim like this on the test, and once you start recognizing them as correlative claims, like this is a correlation between two things. There's a correlation between reading the label and having less fat in your diet. You're almost going to start anticipating that the author is going to foolishly conclude a causal relationship between these two things, right? It just becomes something you anticipate. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to do that every time, but when I see this kind of sentence, I'm like, okay, you're going to draw. I mean, this is the second most common flaw in the test. And lo and behold, this says this shows that. That's the same as saying, I'm about to conclude that reading these labels promotes healthful dietary behavior. So this person does think that the reading is what's causing them to be more healthful. I mean, that's itself assuming that a lower proportion of fat calories is a good thing. But ignoring that flaw, but you get, see, there's at least two flaws here, right? So does having a lower percentage of fat in your diet mean that you're being healthful? I mean, some people would certainly argue that, but I think we're all familiar with the trends these days, right? Some people argue that more fat is good. The point is that we just don't know for sure. It's the premises never said. So this is a problem with this argument, but there's a much bigger problem, and that is going from things that are correlated to a conclusion that says one of them is causing the other, because for all I know, it's the other way around, or I don't know, something else is causing both. Okay, 8. The reasoning in the argument above is flawed in that the argument jumps from correlation to causation. And then A says illicitly infers a cause from a correlation. Illicitly just means wrongly or mistakenly. And then infers, does anyone know what infers means in this context? There's an equivalent word.
Concludes.
Concludes. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Okay, you guys are on top of it. So this argument is concluding a cause from a correlation. Someone asks, let's see, Gloria asks, what would be the premises of this question? There's one premise. It's the first sentence. That's the correlative claim. The second sentence is the conclusion, and that's the causal claim. And it's not that this is not true. It certainly could be true. We just don't know that it's true. And you have to remember that on the LSAT, whenever an author draws a conclusion, whenever they say this shows that, or therefore, or thus, or so, or for this reason, they are saying that what they just told you proves what they're about to say. So the standard isn't, oh, does this provide some evidence for this conclusion? The standard is, does it prove it? And it's like, okay, no, we don't know for sure that this is true, therefore that's a problem. Answer choice A is correct. Let's take a look. That looks like that was the most tempting answer. B, not very many people, no one picked that. Okay, well, great. What does it say? Relies on a sample that's unlikely to be representative of the group as a whole. Yeah, the first premise talked about all people, and the conclusion talked about all people. Well, it didn't even talk about people, but it's presumably referring to everybody. So there's no sample problems here. C, confuses a condition that is necessary for a phenomenon to occur with a condition that is sufficient for that phenomenon to occur. Okay, so this is describing the LSAT's most common flaw, confusing sufficient for necessary. Were there any sufficient or necessary conditions in this argument? Yes, there were. The sufficient condition was, if you're someone who reads nutrition labels, then you are also going to be someone who has significantly less fat in your diet. Okay, cool. So reading the label is sufficient. The necessary condition is the proportion of fat in your diet is going to be lower. Okay, great. The conclusion, though, it doesn't start talking about the necessary condition, which would be having a lower amount of fat in your diet, leading to reading the labels or anything like that. Or actually not even leading to, but like if you have a lower proportion of fat in your diet, then you must read the labels. That would be confusing for sufficient for necessary, right? That would be, oh, we had a sufficient condition, reading labels meant necessarily that you'd have a lower proportion of fat in your diet. And then we concluded because someone has a lower proportion of fat in their diet, they must have read the labels. No, maybe they have a lower proportion of fat in their diet for some other reason. So we're not confusing sufficient for necessary. If anything, the conclusion actually starts with the sufficient condition, right? Reading these labels. But I guess my point here is that there's no confusion going on, even though these a necessary condition and a sufficient condition exist. I think that's why this was probably the second most tempting answer, because you do see that in the premises, there was just no mistake in the conclusion. Are we cool with that? Okay. D, takes for granted that, just replace that with necessarily assumes. Does the argument necessarily assume that there are only two possible alternative explanations of this phenomena or phenomenon? I don't even know what the other possible alternative explanation is. They just give one explanation. They're like, oh, reading these labels makes you have less fat or more healthful. So I don't even see two. E, draws a conclusion, yes, about the intentions of a group of people. I think we can stop there. It says that this promotes healthful dietary behavior. Behavior is an action, not a mental state or an intention. So there's no mention of intentions. E is out, although it looks like this was somewhat tempting. Okay, any questions about this question before we go on? Okay. No, we're good. All right. Speak now or forever hold your peace, I guess is what they say. All right. Next one. Marketing consultant. This is test 73, section 2, question 15. Last year, I predicted that LRG's latest advertising campaign would be unpopular with customers and ineffective in promoting new products. Okay, so this guy was consulted, asked about this ad, and he said, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to promote your products. But the company ignored him. It says, they ignored my predictions and took the advice of a competing consultant. Okay, a little bruised ego here. This season's sales figures show that sales are down and LRG's new products are selling especially poorly. Okay, I'm going to stop right there because that was 3 sentences, but the combination of those 3 sentences basically lead to one thing. We had this ad campaign and we had poor sales. What have we established? A correlation between 2 things. Are you guys cool with that? So that's all we know. All we know is that we had an ad campaign and bad sales. Does that mean that the ad campaign caused the sales to be bad? Well, probably. That's usually what ads are supposed to do. They're supposed to help. But at the end of the day, all I know is that these 2 things are correlated. So I don't really know what's going on here. Thus, the ad campaign was ill-conceived. It certainly could be, but maybe something else caused the sales to be bad, right? COVID-19 is a good example of that. Maybe the ad campaign actually helped. Maybe it helped and the sales would have been even lower. So was the advertising campaign ill-conceived? Maybe, but I don't know for sure. There could be some other factors. That's the thing about drawing a causal conclusion. If you're going to say, hey, this thing didn't work, it failed, it didn't have the intended effect, it didn't cause the result you were expecting. Well, it's a little tough because there are a whole bunch of other things that could be causing whatever the outcome was, right? Okay. Question 15, the marketing consultant's reasoning is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that, as we just said, maybe something else could explain why the figures were so low. A, it takes for granted that LRG's sales would not have been lower still in the absence of the competitor's advertising campaign. Whoa, that's worded a little bit hard. That's a little bit hard to understand. So it takes for granted. I'm going to replace that with necessarily assumes or just assumes. Does this person assume that the sales would not have been lower in the absence of the competitor's advertising campaign? In other words, is the person assuming that they are as low, are the sales as low as they could be? In other words, they could not go any lower. They would not have been any lower. I don't think this person is assuming that they're as low as they possibly could be. I think the person is just assuming that they're lower than they should be. Alex asks, would A work if you took not out? It assumes that sales would have been lower in the absence. No, I don't think that works either. It's not assuming that they would have been lower in the absence of the advertising campaign. I think the person is actually assuming that they would have been higher, right? It's just that, do we have to assume that the sales are as low as they possibly could be? Like, what if we got rid of the advertising campaign and they went a little bit lower? Well, that would suggest that the advertising campaign worked, but maybe not that much. So it still could be ill-conceived. In other words, this person doesn't have to assume that the advertising campaign made the sales as low as they could possibly be. Let's keep going, and then we might have to come back to that one. It is a little wordy. B, does the argument fail to consider that economic factors unrelated to the advertising campaign may have caused LRG's low sales figures? yes, it fails to consider this possibility. And that's a problem, because if they did, then maybe the advertising campaign wasn't actually a failure. It's just that something else demolished the sales. So that's really clear and easy to follow. So I would say that's the answer. C, it takes for granted, in other words, it assumes that in LRG's industry, new products should outsell established products. There's no comparison between the new products and the established products. This argument just solely focuses on the new products. Well, I guess it does say that the new products were selling especially poorly, suggesting that the established products maybe weren't. But do new products need to outsell established products? No, maybe they could sell at the same rate, but apparently they didn't. So this does not need to be assumed. D, it takes for granted, in other words, it assumes that the higher sales of established products are due to effective advertising. Effective advertising, well, we don't really talk about that. And again, we're talking about established products. Are the sales of the established products higher? Yes, they are. So is it assuming that the higher sales of established products are due to effective advertising? No, it's just that maybe the ad campaign had no effect or didn't hurt the established products. It only had an effect on the new products, because that's all this marketing consultant really ends up talking about. So I don't know why the established products were successful. So was it due to effective advertising or just not being affected by bad advertising? I have no idea. So this does not have to be assumed. E, it confuses a condition necessary for increasing product sales with a condition that will ensure increased sales. Again, we didn't see that confusing necessary conditions for sufficient conditions. So this is out. It looks like this was tempting for some of us, but that's just not going on here. It's really about whether the advertising campaign was causing the sales to be lower or not whether there's a if-then statement here or something like that. Okay, I know this was a challenging one. Questions? We're okay with this? Okay, let's keep going. Okay. Test J, section 2, question 21. Driver, my friends say I will one day have an accident because I drive my sports car recklessly. That seems reasonable. If you drive something recklessly, you're probably going to have an accident. But I have done some research, and apparently minivans and larger sedans have very low accident rates compared to sports cars. Okay, that's another correlation, right? So minivans have lower accident rates compared to sports cars. Do we know why? It doesn't say. So all we know is that there's a correlation between these two things. So trading my sports car in for a minivan would lower my risk of having an accident. That word lower is a causal claim, right? Because if something lowers something else, then it's having an effect on it. You guys cool with that? So we just did that same classic flaw. We went from correlation to causation, and I would say that's the problem. By the way, I actually think this driver is right, though. It doesn't really matter because again, the standard on the LSAT is you have to prove your conclusion. So even though this conclusion certainly could be true, and I think it might actually be true, we don't know that for sure. For all we know, the reason that minivans have fewer accidents is because soccer moms are smarter than this dude who's driving a sports car. So Who knows, right? Again, I'm assuming soccer moms drive minivans, but I don't think that's too crazy. The reasoning in the argument, in the driver's argument, is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that, for all we know, there could be another reason why they're safer, and so just changing cars could be the driver, right? A, it infers a cause from a mere correlation. That's exactly what we predicted. That's the answer. B, relies on, let's see, relies on a sample that is too narrow. No, it actually relies on research, which presumably is broad. If you were tempted by this, maybe you were thinking about the person, but he's actually drawing a conclusion about himself on the basis of a large sample. C, misinterprets evidence that a result is likely as evidence that the result is certain. No, I mean, he didn't conclude that driving his sports car would guarantee that he would not have an accident. He just said it would lower his risk. So there's no real like going from likely to certain here. This is out. D, mistakes a condition sufficient for bringing about a result for a condition necessary for doing so. This is the classic confusing sufficient for necessary conditions. We didn't see that here. We went from correlation to causation, so this is wrong. E, relies on a source that is probably not well informed. As far as we know, he is well informed. He did some research, so that's out. Questions? So, question. Is lowering now inferring cause? Is lowering not inferring cause? No, so I'm sorry if I was confusing here, but using the word lower says that you're drawing a causal conclusion. You're saying that the act of trading in my sports car for a minivan that act would lower my risk of having an accident. In other words, switching cars would have an effect. It would cause my risk of having an accident to go down. And so that's a causal conclusion. I hope that makes sense. If my explanation for C didn't make sense, hit the ask button and get a little more clarification. I'm sorry. They can do better than I can sometimes. Cool. Any other questions on this one? Okay. Let's go ahead and do the next 3. Good luck, and I'll see you guys in 6 minutes. All righty. So that was about 6 minutes. How you guys doing? I'm not seeing a lot of enthusiasm. Is that a hard set? Okay. Let's give it a whirl. Sound good? Let's see what's up with this set. The first one, test 73, section 2, question 18. Do we have the poll for that, by the way? Let's see. I'm not seeing it. Sorry. An art historian argues that because 15th century European paintings were generally more planimetric, that is, two-dimensional with no attempt at suggesting depth. Okay, I gotta stop here because this sentence is already getting long. So there are some art historians, they're arguing that because 15th century European paintings, okay, got it, were generally more flat, two-dimensional. They were generally more flat than were 16th century paintings. Okay, they were flatter. 15th century painters had a greater mastery of painting than did 16th century painters. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. What? They lacked depth, therefore they were better? Okay, whatever. However, this conclusion is wrong. I kind of sympathize with this conclusion, which is that these other people are wrong. 15th century European painters did not have a greater mastery of painting. Okay, yeah, they were worse, or they weren't better. That's what it really is saying. They weren't better. Why? Because for the degree to which painting is planimetric is irrelevant to the painter's mastery. Well, okay, as much as I agree with this critic that those first people are wrong, or at least don't make sense, this argument is really, really bad. It's like, hey, the thing you talked about is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Therefore, they weren't better painters. Well, actually, the only thing you could conclude is that we don't know shit, right? Like if you say that this one thing we're talking about is irrelevant, has no bearing on anything, then the only thing that we can safely conclude is that we don't know anything. Because that's all we've talked about is the planimetricity, the planimetric nature of these paintings. So we can't conclude that 15th century painters did not have a greater mastery of painting. For all we know that they did, for some other unknown reason, for some other factor. Are we okay with that assessment? Okay, I see at least one thumbs up. Hopefully that's representative of everybody else. Question 18, the argument is flawed in that it's so bad. It's like, it's basically making the mistake that we don't have any evidence, but I'm going to go ahead and conclude something anyway, right? That's really bad. A, rejects a position merely because the proponent of the position has other objectionable views. Okay, this is not what's happening. I don't even, there aren't any other objectionable views. There's just one objectionable view, and it's the view that this person is going after. So that's not correct. B, illicitly relies on two different meanings of the term mastery. I don't feel like the term mastery changed. I still feel like we're talking about whether they're good or bad at painting. So that's wrong. C, takes a necessary condition for an argument's being inadequate to be a sufficient condition for an argument's being inadequate. Okay, I'm not sure I can even follow what that answer choice is saying. This is confusing sufficient for necessary, right? That's what it's trying to describe. But that's not the prediction I walked away with. It wasn't like, oh, this guy is confusing a sufficient condition for a necessary condition. So I would just move on from this answer choice. There is this weird discussion about an argument being inadequate, and this argument itself is inadequate. And And it is accusing the other argument of being inadequate on some level, but I don't see the confusing sufficient for necessary. So I don't like this answer, but it is giving me pause. D, bases its conclusion on two claims that contradict each other. There's no contradiction here. There's just not enough evidence. E, rejects a position on the grounds that an inadequate argument has been made for it. Yeah, this person basically said, your argument is inadequate because you're talking about something irrelevant, and then rejects the conclusion on that basis. But if the only thing that we can establish is that the argument was inadequate, then the only thing we can conclude is that the conclusion is a big unknown. We don't know. But this person went too far by actually rejecting the position. You'd have to just reject the argument, not the position itself, because if the argument is bad, for all we know, the position could still be correct. It's just that a good argument hasn't been made for it. Answer choice E is clearly what's happening here. I would not probably waste any more time thinking about C, but I'm happy to talk about any of these if you all are still confused. Questions? Yes, Mallory.
So how do you know that that argument is inadequate? Like the 15th century European painters did not have a greater mastery of painting. Is it just like, I guess I kind of shied away from choosing E because I was like, do I really know if that argument is inadequate, or maybe it's an okay argument?
Oh, okay. So actually, so there's two arguments going on here, right? There's the argument by the art historian,
Right.
and then there's the argument, and this is actually kind of funny because it's like an inadequate argument about how another argument is inadequate. So
Correct.
yeah, so the critic is saying, hey, art historian, your argument is inadequate because you're talking about something that's irrelevant. And then unfortunately, the critic's argument ends up also being inadequate because the fact that the other person's argument is inadequate is not enough to conclude that they're wrong. So actually, both of these arguments are inadequate. And answer choice E is referring to the inadequacy of the first argument.
Okay. My brain is hurting.
That's okay. That's a sign of growth. So that's usually what happens. I remember actually once I was sitting on my desk and I was trying to like understand an argument. This is when I was studying for the test, and I just put my head down because it had been like 20 minutes, and I'm like, I can't put these things together.
I already did that today with a different question.
Okay, good. So yeah, those neurons are like trying to connect. They're like, come on, but they're not quite there. But then all of a sudden they did. It's like, okay, great. And then you can start making that connection stronger and stronger. But let me just read through E really slowly and see if I can pin the different parts of it to the original argument. And that might help, because the way flaw arguments work is that they describe what is happening that is wrong, right? That's bad. And that description tends to use abstract wording. And what we need to do is we need to replace the abstract ideas in the answer choice with concrete things from the actual passage. And you can't do that in the wrong answers, but you can in the correct answer. So here, E, does the critic's argument reject a position? Yes. So the critic said, hey, your conclusion is wrong, referring to the art historian's conclusion. So the critic is rejecting the art historian's conclusion or argument, or conclusion really, rejects a position on the grounds, in other words, on the basis of what evidence? That an inadequate argument has been made for the art historian's argument. In other words, the critic is saying, hey, art historian, you made an inadequate argument for your position. You talked about something that was irrelevant. And merely accusing someone of having an inadequate argument is not a good enough reason to actually go ahead and reject their position. All you can really do is conclude that their position hasn't been supported or proven yet. You can't actually say it's wrong.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Is the reason the argument is inadequate because he said it's irrelevant? Because he said the plan
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
because it's not
Yeah.
like irrelevant is not something that can make an argument inadequate. Or like,
No. So the argument is in fact irrelevant or inadequate. We're not disputing that. So the art historian's argument is inadequate if it's true that planimetric stuff is irrelevant.
okay. I think that helps a lot.
Okay, I'm sorry if I'm going in circles, but yeah, it is in fact inadequate.
No, that makes sense. That was my confusion.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, any other questions? Okay. Is it sort of you are wrong because what you said doesn't matter? Yes. You are wrong because what you said doesn't matter. In other words, your evidence is irrelevant. Your evidence doesn't matter. Therefore, you're wrong. The only thing you can really say is your conclusion hasn't been proven yet because your evidence is irrelevant or doesn't matter. Yes, Amber says it perfectly, much better than I did. Just because the argument is inadequate doesn't mean the conclusion is false. The conclusion could still be true. It's just that a good argument hasn't been made for it yet. So, okay. To go in a totally different domain, sorry, we'll just clear this up one last time. If I said, hey, you should get the vaccine because I think that the people who distribute the vaccine are very nice. That's a pretty pathetic argument, right? Like you'd be like, what? You should get it because the people who give it to you are nice? Like that's their kindness is, as this person said in this argument, irrelevant, right? It's irrelevant to whether you should get the vaccine. But if you said to me, hey, Ben, your argument sucks because their kindness is irrelevant, that doesn't now mean that I'm wrong. Oh, okay, well, don't get the vaccine. Like that's going too far, right? Now, for those of you who don't like getting the vaccine, you can have your different reasons, but whatever they are, that's not a good one. Just because my argument sucks. Okay, anyways, let's go to the next one. This is test 73, section 4, question 25. Roberta is irritable only when she is tired. Okay, so this is imposing a restriction, right? She is irritable only when she is tired. It doesn't mean that if she gets tired, she's going to be irritable, but it does mean that if she's irritable, we know she's got to be tired because that's the only time she can be irritable. And she loses things only when she is tired. Okay, so these two things, losing things and being irritable, only happen when she's tired. If she's not tired, she's not going to do these things. Since she has been yawning all day, okay, I don't know what to make of that, and has just lost her keys, she is almost certainly irritable. Okay, if she's yawning, does that mean that she's tired? We have no clue, right? I mean, certainly possible, but we don't know. Maybe she's a great actor. But it says, and she has just lost her keys. So although yawning doesn't tell me whether she's tired, the fact that she just lost her keys must mean that she's tired, because it just said in the first sentence, she loses things only when she is tired. So she can't lose things at any other time. So if she's just lost her keys, then she must be tired. So the yawning thing doesn't tell us anything, and it doesn't matter because we now know for sure that she is tired. So we don't care there's this like problem with yawning. We know she's tired. Does that mean that she's almost certainly irritable? Well, we know that she is irritable only when she is tired. In other words, if we come across her and she's irritable, we know she must be tired. That's a necessary condition. But if she's tired, we don't know that she's now going to be irritable. So maybe she's almost never irritable for all we know. This is the confusing sufficient for necessary. Okay. It's the sufficient condition is being irritable. The necessary condition is being tired. And then it's like, oh, well, she's tired, so she must be irritable or almost certainly irritable. That's treating tiredness, which is a necessary condition, as if it were a sufficient condition, right? And then treating irritableness as if it were a necessary condition, which is not, it was a sufficient condition. Okay, so seeing that, I'm going into the answer and I'm like, I'm looking for something that says confusing sufficient for necessary. The reasoning above is flawed in that A, it infers from a correlation between tiredness and yawning that tiredness causes yawning. Well, first of all, there was no mention of a correlation between tiredness and yawning. It just said that she yawned and hoped that we would jump to the conclusion that she was tired, but there's no mention of a correlation between the two. So this is not happening. And I would say it's therefore wrong. B, the argument assumes the conclusion that it sets out to prove. Answer choice B is a super common answer in logical reasoning, but it's also almost always wrong. Okay, what this describes is a circular argument where you basically say what you're trying to prove, and I've only seen it 3 times on the test. So it's just super rare. I'm not saying that if you see this answer, it's wrong. Please, please do not write me an email after your official test and tell me that you got a question like this wrong because it actually was correct. It could be correct. It's just super rare. Just know what you're looking for. And this is not circular reasoning. C, generalizes on the basis of a single instance. No. The evidence was actually about her all the time, not about her in a single case. So this is out. D, takes a necessary, also, by the way, C says it generalizes. The conclusion is about a specific instance, not about what generally happens. D, takes a necessary condition for Roberta's losing things to be a sufficient condition. Now, I read that and I'm like, oh, confusing sufficient for necessary. Yeah, this sounds like the answer, but of course I'm going to read all of them to make sure I'm not missing anything. E says takes a necessary condition for Roberta's being irritable to be a sufficient condition. And I'm like, oh, wait a sec. Now I actually have to dig into the argument and figure out what was going on. In the conclusion, it said, hey, she is tired, therefore she is almost certainly irritable. And being tired was the necessary condition, and being irritable was the sufficient condition, but the conclusion switched those two and treated tiredness as a sufficient condition and irritability as a necessary condition. So when I look at these things and I say, E, takes a necessary condition for Roberta's being irritable. In other words, what was a necessary condition for her being irritable? Her being tired. That's the very first sentence. Roberta is irritable only when she is tired. That is a necessary condition for her being irritable. And it treats that condition, tiredness, it treats tiredness as if it were a sufficient condition in the conclusion. So E is the correct answer. D takes a necessary condition for Roberta's losing things. What was a necessary condition for her to lose things? Being tired. It doesn't treat that as a sufficient condition because it wasn't going from being tired to losing things. it was going from being tired to being irritable. So that's why E is correct and D is wrong. All right, I see we have a couple questions. Rachel, we'll start with you.
Hey, Ben. Okay, so I got this wrong because when I was rereading the argument, I was saying if she's tired, then she's irritable. If she's tired, then she loses things. Can you help me understand how I did that incorrectly?
Yeah, so basically you misunderstood the meaning of the word only, which is, by the way, the same mistake I made right before I took my official test. I would say like a week or maybe 2 weeks before, I was looking over all the questions I was missing, and I realized that I was treating only if as if it meant if, which is a big problem. But when this sentence says Roberta is irritable only when she is tired, it's imposing a restriction on her irritability. It's saying, hey, look, if she's irritable, then it must be the case that she's tired.
Okay.
But if it had said Roberta is irritable when she is tired, then all of a sudden it would flip around and it would make being tired the sufficient condition and being irritable the necessary condition, because it's like, hey, when she's tired, she is irritable. The order of the sentence doesn't matter. The key is the word only.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Ernesto.
Hey Ben, I picked A, and I mean I understand why it is E. I'm just having a hard time getting to that answer. Like I understand it when you explain it. I feel like I'm not plugging things in correctly in my mind when I'm first reading it as to what is necessary and what is sufficient. Like, is there a tip or something that would help me like get that little click going, like to get my like the gears going, or no?
Sure. So one thing you can do is ask yourself, when you read a claim, is there any necessary thing here, right? So when it says Roberta is irritable only when she is tired, you can ask yourself, okay, does she have to be tired when she's irritable, or does she have to be irritable when she's tired? And by saying she is irritable only when she is tired, it's saying, hey, if she's irritable, then she has to be tired. One way to think about this is to just replace only when or only if with then. It introduces the necessary condition. It introduces what is required. So then when I look at E and it says takes a necessary condition for Roberta's being irritable, I go, oh, the necessary condition was her being tired.
Okay.
Does that help? Or is that still like a lot of word salad?
I mean, I understand it when you're explaining it. I just feel like I struggle with actually formulating that thought process myself.
Yeah, some of this does just take time, just like reading a sentence and thinking to yourself, okay, which thing here is sufficient and which thing here is necessary, if anything. Sometimes claims don't make necessary or sufficient condition assertions, but if you say you can apply to law school only after you've taken the LSAT, well, which thing is necessary? Applying to law school or taking the LSAT?
Taking the LSAT.
Taking the LSAT. That's a little easier because it's a domain that we're familiar with, but it's the same exact sentence structure, right? Applying to law school is possible only after you've taken the LSAT. I'm saying that's the necessary condition. So Roberta is irritable only when she is tired. Okay, well, that's the necessary condition. That's required. She has to be tired. If she's not, think about it this way. If she's not tired, then she can't be irritable because she's irritable only when she's tired.
Okay. All right,
so I know I'm just kind of repeating myself.
Yeah.
Part of this is just like, is seeing the sentence, trying to tease out what you think is necessary and doing that over and over and over again until it's just natural. You read the sentence and you're like, oh, this is saying that this thing is required and this thing is sufficient. If you can start talking that way, then you're talking the same way that the test writers talk, which is a little bizarre, but it's how they talk.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Yes. Let's see. So Gloria, only if, only when is the then clause, is the necessary condition. Yeah. Whatever comes after only if or only when is the necessary condition. That's exactly right. Laura. Question.
Yes. I actually got this question right. However, because I usually just diagram the conditional and the conditional statements into the contrapositive. However, I wrote, so R is tired, only if she loses her keys and is irritable. And then my contrapositive is that R is not tired when she is not losing her things or irritable. But
No, I mean, it almost sounds like you actually have it backwards, which I think is one of the challenges with diagramming. I've diagrammed so many things, but I would honestly let go of that and just try to understand when you read a sentence, oh, which thing is necessary? Because if you can ask yourself that and develop that intuitive sense, it's just gonna prevent you from making so many mistakes that people make when they become robotic. Like when they're just like, okay, here's this, the LSAT throws a little like twist in the sentence or reorders the clauses or something, and all of a sudden they got things backwards, as opposed to just reading the sentence and being like, okay, what's necessary for what? And you don't have to memorize a bunch of terms and things like that. I mean, I think it's helpful to know that only if introduces the necessary condition, but more than that, I would like you to like read a sentence that has only if or only when in it and feel like, oh, I can feel that this thing is necessary. Without it, she can't be irritable. If she's not tired, she can't be irritable. So being tired must be necessary. If you can say that, then you're fluent in this terminology. That's really where you want to get. And then you're not diagramming and you're far less likely to make mistakes because you understand it on like an intuitive level.
okay, thank you.
Yep. Samir.
Okay, hi. Just real quick. So I totally see how tired is necessary, and I see how losing things and being irritable is sufficient. Am I right so far?
You're
Okay.
correct so far. You're good.
All right. They're trying to conclude that she is irritable.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to understand, like, and they're saying since she lost her keys, so that shows that she lost something. So therefore, all we conclude is that she's tired, not irritable, right?
Yes, that's all we could conclude, right? Like
Okay.
in a normal universe, we'd say, oh, she lost her keys. And we'd be like, well, she loses things only when she's tired. It must be true that she's tired. So we can safely conclude that. That's not where the problem starts. The problem starts when the author then goes from that to therefore she must be irritable.
Right. Okay. So like the answer choice, like I get that, but I guess I'm trying to translate the answer choice into what I understand. So takes a necessary condition for Roberta's being irritable, which I don't get what that they're trying to say there.
Okay, that's your problem. So first, let's stop there. What is the necessary condition for Roberta's being irritable? What is necessary? There you go. So it takes, or in other words, it treats tiredness as if it were a sufficient condition.
Okay. So where do they say tired in the conclusion now?
So they didn't say that. They jumped to that conclusion from the fact that it was she lost her keys. But that jump was okay. We can't argue with that jump. If the person came to us and said, hey, she lost her keys, and then said that it's not explicitly stated, but if the person then said, therefore she must be tired, we would all have to agree with them, right? We'd be like, yep, yep. Now, that's why this argument is mildly tricky, because the person jumped to that conclusion, legitimately so, that they are tired, without saying so. So it's implicit. It's not stated in the argument. So we're all sitting here going, oh, she must be tired. And that was fine. But then it's like, therefore, she is almost certainly irritable. That's where the problem took place. And it went from this unstated idea that she's tired to this stated idea that she's irritable.
Oh, I see. Okay. We concluded that she was tired because she lost her
Yeah.
keys, not because she was yawning all day. So that's
Yes,
kind of
yeah. That is problematic, but we can ignore it because we know she was tired for another reason, which is a totally legit reason.
okay. So when they say has lost her keys, you can substitute that in for saying she was tired in a sense. Therefore, she's
Exactly.
irritable. But that doesn't make
Exactly.
sense. That's reversing it. I got it.
Yep, and then we're going from tiredness to irritability, which is not good, and that's exactly what E says.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay, thank you guys. Let's go to the next one. We got 2 minutes. Good luck with that. If you have to take off, totally understand. Test J, section 3, question 25. Some anthropologists argue that the human species could not have survived prehistoric times if the species had not evolved the ability to cope with diverse natural environments. Okay, so there's some anthropologists out there. They're like, look, we wouldn't have made it. We wouldn't have survived those prehistoric times if we didn't have the ability to cope with diversity in the environment, right? What is necessary there and what is sufficient? Anyone want to give this a shot now that we've done it a few times? Don't think too hard about like the sentence and breaking it down and what's if and what's then. Just think, okay, what is this person saying was necessary and for what?
Human species could not have survived is necessary.
They
Thought it was
Evolved
So
is
here-
necessary for
Sufficient.
survival.
not
Sufficient.
evolved.
So Samir, you're not necessarily wrong. You're looking at the sentence, you're saying, oh, here's the if clause at the end, and therefore the then clause is at the beginning. Therefore, that's the necessary condition, right?
Right. Yeah.
Technically, you're right, but it's not the way we think intuitively. Intuitively, what I would say here, and this is flipping this around, but it's saying, okay, what was necessary? Our ability to cope with diverse environments was necessary to survive, right? Like, hey, if you wanted to survive, then you must have had this ability. That was required. Now, that's the word that we supposedly should not say, which is contrapositive, but it doesn't matter. You don't even need to know that, because if you look at that sentence and just read it, you're like, what is this person ultimately trying to say? They're saying, if we wanted to survive, then we necessarily must have had this ability to cope. Presumably we did survive because we're here. So if this person is right, then we also have that ability, or we evolved it. So I guess, Samir, sorry, I'm not saying you're wrong, you're right, but it's almost like it's more formulaic the way you're approaching it, right? And it's not intuitive and it's not like flexible. So, okay, bottom line, survival was sufficient. What was necessary for survival? The ability to cope with diverse natural environments. Now we have this other person, the person who's actually making this argument, come in and they're like, however, there is considerable evidence that Australopithecus, please, if you can say that better than me, go for it. Afrinus, I can't even say this word. Okay, I'm just gonna say this species, a prehistoric species, by the way, related to early humans, also thrived in a diverse array of environments, but became extinct. Hence, the anthropologist claim is false. Okay, so this prehistoric species had this ability to cope with diverse natural environments, but ultimately didn't survive. Does that matter? If the ability to cope with diverse environments was necessary, that doesn't mean that if you had it, you would necessarily survive. It just means that if you didn't have it, you wouldn't survive, right? So for all we know, there are a whole bunch of other necessary things that require you to live, right? That you don't get blown up by an asteroid or something like that. So to say that the anthropologist claim is false is wrong. This person is treating a necessary condition, the ability to cope with diverse natural environments, as if it were a sufficient condition. They're like, hey, they had this condition, but they didn't survive, so it must not be sufficient. But the anthropologist isn't claiming that it's sufficient. The anthropologist is only claiming that it was necessary. So anyways, the reasoning in the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that the argument confuses a condition being required for a given result to occur, survival, in one case, with a conditions being sufficient for such a result to occur in a similar case, the other prehistoric species. Okay, that's wordy, but since I'm looking for the confusing a sufficient for necessary condition flaw, I would hold on to this answer and probably quickly go through the rest. B takes for granted, or in other words, assumes. It assumes that if one species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive certain conditions, at least one related extinct species must have had the same characteristic. Whoa, okay. The argument did not talk about a species that had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive. If you claim that the characteristic enabled you to survive, then you're actually claiming that that characteristic was sufficient, right? And anyways, this argument isn't concluding that at least one related extinct species must have had the same characteristic. It actually said that that species had that characteristic, the ability to cope with diverse environments. So that's just wrong for at least two reasons. C generalizes from the fact that one species with a certain characteristic survived certain conditions. We survived certain conditions. That all related species with the same characteristic must have survived exactly the same conditions. No, the person did not conclude this. In fact, they said that the other species died. So they weren't concluding that they must have survived. They said, no, they didn't survive. So this is not happening, therefore it's wrong. Fails to consider the possibility that this species, which I won't pronounce, had one or more characteristics that lessened its chances of surviving prehistoric times. It did fail to consider this possibility, but the real mistake here was assuming that that characteristic was sufficient. So I don't feel like this works. E fails to consider the possibility that even if a condition caused a result to occur in one case, it was not necessary to cause the result to occur in a similar case. No, wait, even if a condition caused a result to occur in one case, again, the condition didn't cause the result to occur, that would make it almost like sufficient. It was considered a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. So this is not describing something that happened in the argument. Boy, these are wordy answers. No wonder this is a level 5 question. Anyways, A is the only answer that describes confusing sufficient for necessary. And so this is the correct answer. What questions do we have? Ernesto?
So for this one, I picked B. The reason I picked B, it was kind of like the same reason as the other question that we did with the companies and how you explained the COVID situation, how outside factors could have been the reason for that company's not doing so well.
Yeah.
So in that question, we brought something that wasn't necessarily inside of the actual question. It never stated anything having to do with outside factors, for example, the economy or anything like that. So for this one, takes for granted that if one species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive certain conditions, at least one related extinct species must have had the same characteristics. Wouldn't that be like the same type of questioning your answer for that or no?
Okay, so this, I'm gonna replace the abstract words in this answer and try to tie it up with the passage. So really what this question is asking is, so does the argument take for granted? In other words, does it assume what I'm about to read to you? And
Okay.
so if an answer choice is going to claim that the argument is assuming something, then it must be something that the argument did take into account, not something external, right? Like you were like, hey, like, what about not considering something outside, or what about some other factor?
Yeah.
But answer choice B is not describing an external thing or something that wasn't thought about, because it's accusing the author of taking something for granted, which means to assume something. So answer choice B is kind of like, hey, buddy, you assumed this, you must have been thinking this. And so then the question becomes, okay, did the author have to think this? And the question is here, did the author have to think that if one species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive certain conditions? And right there, I'm like, we never talked about a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive. We only talked about a characteristic that was necessary for survival, not necessarily that it enabled survival. So I'm already like skeptical of whether this even exists, but even if that is referring to this ability to cope with diverse environments, does the author also then have to assume that at least one related extinct species must have had the same characteristic? I don't think the author had to assume that another species had to have this characteristic. Maybe we were the only one that had it. Instead, the author just came out and said that a species did have this characteristic, right? So it's a little weird to be like, hey, you're assuming that at least one other species must have had this characteristic. And the person's like, no, I'm not assuming that. I actually just said that there was one that had this, right? So one, it's not really happening. And two, it's a weird accusation to make, because the person's like, that's not really my problem here. We all agree that there was a related extinct species that had this characteristic. The issue is, what does that imply, or what can we safely conclude from that?
Okay.
Does that
Thank you.
help at all?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, any other questions on this one? We're good? Okay, I know it's a lot of wordy answers, really. I think that's what makes this one challenging. Okay. Well, thank you guys. Thanks for staying late. Sorry about that. If you have questions that I didn't get to, hit the ask button. Abigail is in charge of the amazing ask team, and they do wonderful things. So I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes and just answer any one-on-one questions that you guys might have. Thanks for coming.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So, when the answer choices are like sufficient and necessary condition, I know we discussed it before, but it often seems like it kind of slowed down my brain when I have to go back and reanalyze the whole argument in the sufficient and the necessary form, and then figure out if it's actually doing what the answer choice says it's doing.
Yeah.
Do you recommend like practicing more, like converting a argument into just logic form? Would that help?
No, actually, what you need to do is you need to spend more time reading the argument and understanding it on an intuitive level, whether it's making like a claim about something being sufficient or a claim about something being necessary. Because when you said, hey, I read that answer choice, it slows me down and I go back to the passage, that suggests to me that, okay, well, if there was a confusing sufficient for necessary flaw going on, you missed it, right? So you need to like catch that up front. And then what ends up happening is these questions actually get extraordinarily easy, even these level 5 ones. Because what happens is you read the argument and you're like, oh, whoa, they're confusing sufficient for necessary. And then you're really just going through the answers pretty quickly, looking for something that's describing that. Now you don't want to oversimplify it, but in most cases, the correct answer is going to talk about that confusion, and the wrong answers are just going to be something else. The flip side of that is when you don't see this flaw, this answer choice is very common. It's very common for them to talk about confusing sufficient for necessary, but right away you're like, hey, I didn't see that flaw, so this is wrong. Whereas the rest of the test takers, and this is probably what you're feeling right now, are sitting on that answer saying, what the fuck is this saying? Is this the answer? And they're consuming all this sort of time trying to understand it. And you can really just instantly ignore it if you recognize the original argument had no such flaw. So that's really where you want to turn your focus. Turn your focus on the original argument and trying to recognize whether it has necessary or sufficient conditions.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Any last thoughts? All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming. Have a good night, and we will.
Ben, you got a minute or no?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Ben, I hit the first 18 correctly, but I do realize that if you slow down, your accuracy goes up. So my question to you is, how exactly should I tackle the last bit that I'm running out of time to tackle?
Well, so you did 18 questions and you got them all correct.
Yep, that seems to be the pattern.
Okay, and then you're out of time.
And then I'm out of time. I invest so much time up front that I can't get the last bit.
Okay, actually, you're on the right path. I mean, if you can do that consistently, that means that your understanding of the test and your approach to the questions is almost certainly, not necessarily, but almost certainly the right approach, right? Which means every time you're doing those questions, you're building good habits. And it's just the nature of doing something over and over again. You're going to get naturally faster at it and more confident, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised at all if within a week you start seeing yourself hitting 19 and then 20. You know, it's not like this is going to happen overnight, but you're going to be like, oh, whoa, I just did a section and I got to 20 questions and yeah, I didn't get all, I got 19 out of, or 20 out of 20, but whoa, it's not going to be something where you flip a switch and then all of a sudden you can do the last 5 or 6. It's going to be like, okay, everything went a little bit faster for all of them. And now you have an extra minute and a half to do that last question. One more question.
Okay. Thank you, Ben.
Yep.
Do you recommend me reading the question first or just going through it and treating every argument like new every time?
New every time. Just read that argument, understand it the best you possibly can, and then you can read the question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Ben,
Yeah.
just got one small, not a question,
Yeah.
but when we did that boot camp circle slash, the audio portion was okay, but the video portion of it, it kept blurring out and you couldn't really follow how he was putting it on the board. Is it any way possible that you might be able to look at that and see if that could be a redo or something that could enhance the video of it?
Sure. Which one were you talking about? The boot camp?
When Matt did the circle slash boot camp,
Oh, okay.
he did a presentation of it.
What Marvin's talking about, which class it is?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a recorded class. I think I have it in one of the lessons too, the circle slash boot camp. It was like a special event that he recorded.
Okay.
Exactly.
What was wrong with the video?
it's the video portion of it. It keeps it's not staying in focus like the current presentations are going today.
Okay,
Because that was
I'll take
done
a
a
look at
while
it.
ago.
Yeah, I didn't notice anything wrong with it when I posted it the first time, but I'll take a look and see if.
Yeah,
um,
it does that. So I just wanted to see what we could do to enhance it more.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Marvin. We'll take a look. Maybe it's something where when Matt moves, the camera refocuses on him or something. I wonder if he has his own camera, or if he's using his computer's camera. That might be another
Right,
thing.
he also might have had a different camera back then, if his video's
Yeah.
better now.
Yeah. You're saying his video is good now, Marvin? This is Matt, right? Matt Dumont.
Matt did it. The video is not as good. The audio is good, but the video keeps going in and out of focus.
Okay, yeah. Well, maybe ask Matt, Abigail, if he has a newer setup, we could try it again. I'm sure he'd be happy to do it. So
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
cool. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good night. And
You too.
yep, talk to you later.
Bye-bye.